The hospital's marble lobby echoed with the metallic clang of a wheelchair hitting the floor. But what happened next would shatter everything Jennifer thought she knew about the broken man she was divorcing. For 3 years, she'd pitied the crippled husband confined to that chair, serving him meals, pushing him through their modest apartment, counting the days until she could finally escape to her wealthy new lover's arms. But she never questioned why he smiled quietly whenever she mentioned her grueling shifts at Mercy General Hospital. The divorce papers were signed that morning, crisp and final in her designer purse, but her mother Eleanor had insisted on one final humiliation before Jennifer could truly be free. At 2:47 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor's Louboutin heel connected with the wheelchair's frame in the hospital's ground floor, sending it and the man Jennifer had served those papers to just hours earlier, crashing sideways onto the polished tile. But her new lover Derek merely laughed from his position beside the reception desk, his arm draped possessively around Jennifer's waist. The other nurses gasped and scattered, but Jennifer felt only a cold satisfaction watching the man she'd married struggle on the ground. Then he stood up. Not the trembling half-rise of someone attempting physical therapy, but a fluid, powerful motion that defied 3 years of supposed paralysis, and Jennifer's world tilted before everything went black. When she opened her eyes seconds later, sprawled on the floor where she'd fainted from shock, the man she'd believed was crippled stood above her in an immaculately tailored suit that had somehow replaced his shabby clothes. But that wasn't what made her blood run cold. The hospital staff, her colleagues, her supervisor, even the chief of surgery, were bowing. Actually bowing to the husband she'd just divorced, the man her mother had kicked over while her lover laughed. Who was the broken man Jennifer had pitied for 3 years, and why had every person in Mercy General Hospital suddenly dropped to one knee before him? What was the real reason he'd never objected to the divorce, even smiled when she'd screamed about wasting her youth on a cripple? Why had her mother Eleanor gone completely pale and silent, all her earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist? And what would the husband, the one who'd just revealed he could walk, who commanded such inexplicable respect, do next that would leave Eleanor, the woman who'd kicked his wheelchair over while Derek laughed, utterly devastated? The morning had started like any other betrayal, calculated, cold, and carefully timed for maximum convenience. Jennifer Morrison stood in the kitchen of their cramped 2-bedroom apartment, but her mind was already in Derek's penthouse, imagining the marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows that would replace these yellowing walls. The divorce papers sat on the breakfast table beside a bowl of oatmeal she'd microwaved for the man in the wheelchair, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him yet. "Jennifer?" His voice carried that same gentle quality it had held for 3 years, soft but not weak, questioning but never demanding. "You seem distracted today." She turned to face Ethan Rivers, though she'd trained herself to think of him as the burden or the mistake or anything but his actual name, and forced her expression into something resembling concern, but her heart hammered with anticipation. Today was the day. Today, after 36 months of playing the dutiful wife to a crippled nobody, she would finally be free. "I'm fine," she said, sliding the papers across the table with one manicured finger, but her voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "Just need you to sign these." Ethan's dark eyes, she'd forgotten how unusually perceptive they were, how they seemed to see through her careful masks, dropped to the documents, but his expression remained frustratingly neutral. No shock, no anger, no desperate pleas. He simply reached for the pen she'd placed beside the papers, his hand steady despite 3 years of supposed nerve damage. But Jennifer was too focused on her exit strategy to notice the contradiction. The grounds are irreconcilable differences, she continued, reciting the script her lawyer had provided, but adding her own venom to each word. Quick, clean, no contest. You keep your disability payments, I keep my sanity. Something flickered across Ethan's face then. Not pain, but something else. Something that looked almost like recognition of a long-awaited moment. But it vanished before Jennifer could identify it. He signed with a flourish that seemed oddly practiced for someone with trembling hands. But again, she didn't notice. 3 years, Ethan said softly, capping the pen with deliberate care, but his tone held no accusation. That's exactly how long my... He stopped himself, a small smile playing at his lips. Never mind. I hope Derek makes you happy, Jennifer. She froze, her hand halfway to grabbing the papers. How did you... You've been wearing his cologne for 6 months, Ethan explained, his voice still gentle. But there was steel underneath now, a foundation she'd never detected before. You smile at your phone in ways you haven't smiled at me in years, and you've taken 17 extra shifts at the hospital that somehow never appear on your pay stubs. Jennifer's face flushed, but not with shame, with anger at being caught, at having her carefully constructed lies exposed by a man who couldn't even walk, but she channeled that anger into cruelty. So what? You want me to feel guilty? You want me to stay out of pity? She laughed, harsh and brittle. I've given you 3 years, Ethan. 3 years of my youth, my beauty, my prime dating. Years, all wasted on pushing your wheelchair and pretending I don't notice the pity in everyone's eyes. I never asked you to stay, Ethan replied quietly, folding the signed papers with precise creases, but his hands didn't shake at all now. In fact, I remember suggesting divorce about 2 years ago, when you first started staying late at the hospital. You were the one who insisted we work through it. Because Derek hadn't been rich enough yet, Jennifer thought but didn't say. 2 years ago he'd been just another ambitious pharmaceutical rep, but now he was regional director with a 7-figure salary and connections that made her hospital administrator grovel, but Ethan didn't need to know that. Well, now I'm done working through it, she snapped, snatching the papers from his hands, but her fingers brushed his and she jerked back as if burned. Even after all this time, some traitorous part of her remembered when those hands had made her feel safe, cherished, before the accident that had stolen his ability to walk, but she crushed that memory ruthlessly. My mother's right. I never should have married someone so beneath me. That was the first lie she'd told herself so many times it had calcified into belief. The truth, buried under 3 years of resentment and Derek's poisonous whispers, was that Ethan had never been beneath her. When they'd met 5 years ago, he'd been... She couldn't quite remember. Her memories of that time were oddly hazy, as if someone had taken an eraser to the sharp edges, but she recalled thinking he was surprisingly cultured, for someone who claimed to work in hospital administration. Your mother, Ethan repeated, and now his smile was definitely knowing, but Jennifer was already heading for the door. Yes, Eleanor Morrison. I imagine she'll be quite surprised today. The only thing surprising her will be how fast I moved on, Jennifer shot back, but she paused at the threshold, some ancient instinct making her turn. For what it's worth, Ethan, I did love you, before the accident, before you became this. She gestured at the wheelchair with distaste. Before I became crippled, Ethan supplied helpfully, but there was no bitterness in his voice, only that same quiet amusement that had been growing throughout their conversation. It's fine, Jennifer, you can say it. I've heard worse from your mother. That was true. Eleanor had perfected the art of the cutting comment, the casual cruelty dressed up as concern, but Jennifer had never stopped her. Some daughter, some wife, she'd been. Goodbye, Ethan, Jennifer said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She was walking out that door and never looking back, heading straight to the hospital where Derek was waiting to take her to lunch at that new French restaurant downtown. But Ethan's next words stopped her cold. "See you at work, Jennifer. I have some business at Mercy General today. Rather important business, actually." She wanted to ask what he meant. Ethan never came to the hospital, claimed the crowds and pitying stares were too much. But she was already late, and Derek hated waiting, so she let the door slam behind her without another word. The thing about carefully constructed lies, Jennifer would later reflect, is that they require constant maintenance. One crack, one moment of inattention, and the whole edifice comes tumbling down. But as she drove to Mercy General that morning, divorce papers in her designer purse, a gift from Derek naturally, she had no idea how catastrophically her foundation was about to crumble. Mercy General Hospital rose 12 stories above the city's medical district, a gleaming monument to cutting-edge healthcare and, according to the plaques in the lobby, compassionate patient care. Jennifer had worked there for 5 years, starting as a floor nurse and working her way up to the cardiac unit, but she'd always felt the building looked down on her, judged her with its pristine windows and marble facade. She knew every inch of those 12 floors, knew which doctors were sleeping with which nurses, which administrators were skimming from the budget, which surgeons had substance abuse problems they thought they'd hidden. But she didn't know, had never thought to ask who actually owned the place. "There's my beautiful girl," Derek purred as Jennifer entered through the staff entrance, his arms immediately encircling her waist in a possessive gesture that was becoming familiar but not necessarily comfortable. Did he sign? "Like the pathetic cripple he is," Jennifer confirmed, and hated how easily the cruelty came now, how Derek's influence had poisoned even her vocabulary. "It's done, Derek. I'm free." Derek Thornton was objectively handsome, 6'2", broad shoulders, the kind of carved jawline that looked photoshopped, but Jennifer was beginning to notice how his eyes never quite matched his smile. Still, he had money and connections, and had promised to introduce her to people who could advance her career beyond the limitations of her nursing degree. So she ignored the warning signs her instincts kept flagging. "We should celebrate," Derek murmured, his lips against her ear, but his next words were interrupted by a commotion in the main lobby. Jennifer pulled away, smoothing her scrubs with practiced efficiency. "I'm on shift in 20 minutes. We'll celebrate tonight." "Your mother's here," Derek said instead, and Jennifer's stomach dropped. Eleanor Morrison was many things: social climber, status-obsessed, casually cruel, but she was not the kind of woman who made unannounced hospital visits, especially not to a daughter whose career choices she'd always considered disappointing. Something was wrong. Jennifer found her mother in the main lobby, dressed in her usual armor of designer labels and aggressive jewelry, but Eleanor's face was flushed with an emotion Jennifer recognized instantly: vindictive pleasure. "There you are," Eleanor announced loudly enough for the nearby visitors to hear, but her eyes were scanning the lobby for someone. "I thought we could have lunch. Celebrate your freedom from that wheelchair-bound disappointment you married." "Mother," Jennifer hissed, acutely aware of her co-workers' stares. But Eleanor was on a roll now, her voice rising with each word. 3 years you wasted on him, Jennifer. 3 years of your youth, your beauty, your prime childbearing years, all spent playing nursemaid to a cripple who couldn't even— "Mrs. Morrison, perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere private," a smooth voice interrupted, and Jennifer turned to find her supervisor, Catherine Wells, standing with the kind of rigid posture that meant trouble. But Eleanor was beyond caring about propriety. "Private? Why should I be private? My daughter finally had the sense to divorce that pathetic man, and I intend to celebrate it publicly. In fact," her eyes lit up with malicious glee, "there he is now." Jennifer's head whipped around so fast her neck popped. Sure enough, Ethan's wheelchair was gliding through the hospital's automatic doors, pushed by a hospital orderly Jennifer vaguely recognized. But something was different. His clothes, for one thing, instead of his usual threadbare hoodies, he wore a dark gray suit that looked expensive, but that was impossible. Ethan lived on disability payments and whatever pittance his mysterious administrative work brought in. "Oh, this is perfect," Eleanor declared, her voice dripping with theatrical delight, but her eyes were pure venom. "One last chance to tell him exactly what I think of men who trap ambitious young women with sob stories about accidents and paralysis." "Mother, don't," Jennifer started, but Derek's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Let her," Derek whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "He deserves it. 3 years of your life, Jennifer. He owes you this." Later, much later, Jennifer would wonder why Derek seemed so eager for this confrontation, why his pharmaceutical company had suddenly increased its stake in Mercy General's supply contracts, why he'd been asking such pointed questions about the hospital's ownership structure, but in that moment she only felt a guilty thrill of anticipation. Eleanor strutted across the marble floor with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences, her Louboutins clicking an aggressive rhythm, but Ethan's face remained perfectly serene. He didn't try to wheel away, didn't call out for help, just sat there with that same small smile Jennifer had found so infuriating at breakfast. "You," Eleanor announced, stopping directly in front of the wheelchair, but positioning herself so everyone in the lobby could watch. "You are a leech, a parasite, a pathetic excuse for a man who trapped my daughter with your disability and your needs and your—" "Mother, that's enough," Jennifer said weakly, but she didn't move to stop what was coming, and that inaction would haunt her. "It's not nearly enough," Eleanor continued, her voice rising to a crescendo. "My daughter is a beautiful, accomplished woman who wasted 3 years pushing your wheelchair, fetching your medications, pretending to love a cripple who can't even—" The wheelchair toppled. Eleanor had kicked it, not hard, not violently, but with enough force to send it crashing sideways onto the marble floor, and Ethan with it. The lobby erupted in gasps and shouts, but Eleanor just stood there triumphantly while Derek laughed, actually laughed from his position beside Jennifer. "Oops," Eleanor said, her voice syrupy with false concern. "Did I do that? I'm so sorry. But then again, you're used to being helpless on the floor, aren't you?" Jennifer knew she should move, should help, should do something, but she was frozen, watching Ethan struggle on the polished tile in his expensive suit that made no sense, and some part of her, some small poisoned part that Derek and Eleanor had cultivated, felt satisfaction. Then Ethan stood up. Not the painful, trembling attempt of someone in physical therapy, not the half-crouch of someone testing damaged legs. He simply stood, smooth and powerful and utterly controlled, and the lobby went silent. Jennifer's vision tunneled. Her ears began ringing. The world tilted sideways, and she was aware of falling but couldn't stop herself. But the last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Ethan's face, no longer gentle, no longer patient, but carved from something harder than marble and twice as cold. Consciousness returned in fragments. Jennifer became aware of the cool tile against her cheek first, then the murmur of voices above her, but her brain refused to process what she'd just witnessed. Ethan couldn't walk. He was crippled. 3 years in that wheelchair, 3 years of doctor's appointments and medical bills, and her resentment building like plaque around her heart. "Someone get a gurney," a voice called, Catherine, her supervisor, but there was a strange note in her tone, something between horror and awe. "That won't be necessary," another voice replied, and Jennifer's eyes flew open because that voice was Ethan's but different, carrying an authority she'd never heard from him. "Just help her sit up," She'll be fine." Jennifer forced herself upright, her head swimming, but what she saw made her wonder if she was still unconscious and dreaming. The entire lobby, patients, visitors, nurses, doctors, even the security guards, had dropped to one knee. Not metaphorically, actually kneeling on the marble floor like subjects before royalty, but they weren't looking at Eleanor or Derek or even Jennifer. They were looking at Ethan, who stood in the center of the lobby in his gray suit, no wheelchair in sight, his posture radiating the kind of power Jennifer associated with hospital board members and visiting dignitaries. "What?" Jennifer croaked, but her throat was too dry to continue. "Dr. Rivers," Catherine Wells said, her voice shaking, but using a title that made Jennifer's confusion deepen into something approaching panic. "We weren't expecting you today. If we'd known—" "Dr. Rivers?" Eleanor interrupted shrilly, apparently recovering from her own shock, but her bravado sounded hollow now. "What kind of joke is this? He's a cripple. He can't even—" "Mrs. Morrison." "Ethan, Dr. Rivers," said quietly, but his voice cut through the lobby like a scalpel through flesh. "I think it's time you learned exactly who your daughter married, and exactly whose hospital you just caused a scene in." The silence that followed was so complete, Jennifer could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She looked at Derek, hoping for explanation or support, but his face had gone pale, and he was backing away slowly, like someone who just realized they were standing in a minefield. "Catherine," Ethan continued, his attention shifting to Jennifer's supervisor, "would you please explain to Mrs. Morrison and her daughter who owns Mercy General Hospital?" Catherine Wells, a woman who Jennifer had seen, remained composed during 5 alarm traumas and hostile board meetings, was actually trembling. "You do, sir. You own it. You own all 12 Mercy General facilities across the state, plus the medical research division and the pharmaceutical partnerships." The floor seemed to drop away beneath Jennifer's feet, but she was already sitting down, so she just slumped against the reception desk, her mind racing through 3 years of memories and recalculating every single one. That's impossible," Eleanor stammered, but her voice had lost all its earlier venom. "He's a cripple. He lives in a 2-bedroom apartment. Was many things," Ethan replied, and now his eyes found Jennifer's and she flinched at what she saw there. Not anger, but a profound disappointment that cut deeper than any rage could have. "But I was never a cripple, Mrs. Morrison. I was recovering. From an assassination attempt, actually, carried out by a pharmaceutical executive who wanted to take over my hospital network's supply contracts." Derek made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, but Ethan wasn't finished. "The bullet severed my spinal cord. Completely. The best surgeons in the country said I'd never walk again, but I rebuilt myself, Mrs. Morrison. Experimental neural surgery, stem cell treatments, physical therapy so intensive most people would have quit. 3 years of pretending to be helpless so I could identify the people who'd planned my death and root them out of my organization." Jennifer's mouth opened and closed silently, but no words came out. 3 years. 3 years she'd pitied him, resented him, betrayed him, all while he was— "You were testing me," she whispered finally, the realization hitting like a physical blow. "The whole time you were testing me." Ethan's expression softened slightly, but not enough to offer comfort. "No, Jennifer, not testing, hoping. I was hoping that the woman I married, the woman I loved, would stand by me through recovery. I told you 2 years ago that you could leave. I gave you an out. You chose to stay." "Because—" Jennifer started but couldn't finish. Because Derek hadn't been promoted yet. Because she wanted to look noble while setting up her exit strategy. Because she was a coward and a liar and a dozen other things she'd never admitted to herself. Because you wanted to look like the devoted wife while planning your escape. Ethan finished for her, his voice still gentle, but each word was a knife. "I know, Jennifer. I've always known. I had security monitors installed in our apartment after the first assassination attempt. For safety," he added, seeing her expression. "But they also showed me every time Derek visited while I was supposedly at physical therapy. Every kiss, every plan you made for your future without me." The lobby had gone from silent to utterly still, every person frozen in their position of respect or shock, but Jennifer could only stare at the man she'd married and divorced in the same day, realizing she'd never actually known him at all. Eleanor found her voice first, but it came out small and weak. But you let her divorce you. This morning, you signed the papers." "Of course I did," Ethan replied, and now there was something almost like pity in his expression as he looked at Eleanor. "Because I wanted Jennifer to be free to make her choice, free to choose the man she thought she loved, the life she thought she wanted, and I wanted to see what she'd do with that freedom." "You set this up," Jennifer breathed, pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "You knew my mother would come here. You knew she'd make a scene. You knew Derek would—" She stopped, turning to look at Derek, who was now actively trying to edge toward the exit. "What did he do? What does he have to do with this?" Ethan's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "Derek Thornton, Regional Director for Pharmaco Industries, the same company whose CEO, Marcus Brennan, ordered my assassination 3 years ago, the same company that's been trying to gain controlling interest in my hospital network through increasingly aggressive contract negotiations and, when that failed, through attempted corporate espionage." Derek was running now, not walking, sprinting for the doors, but hospital security. Jennifer belatedly realized they were much more than rent-a-cops, moved with military precision, intercepted him in 3 steps. "You see," Ethan continued conversationally, as Derek was efficiently restrained and searched, producing a recording device and what looked like contract documents from his jacket. Derek's job was to get close to someone with inside access to Mercy General, someone who could provide information about my condition, my recovery, my plans. Someone who worked here but didn't know who I really was. "Me," Jennifer whispered, bile rising in her throat. "He used me." "He used your ambition," Ethan corrected gently. "Your dissatisfaction, your resentment of being married to a disabled man. He found your weakness and exploited it beautifully. The expensive gifts, the promises of advancement, the way he made you feel sophisticated and appreciated. All of it was designed to make you trust him, talk to him, share details about your home life." Jennifer's mind was reeling backward through 6 months of relationship, recalculating every romantic dinner and sweet word, and finding manipulation in all of it. The questions he asked about you, about your medical appointments, your doctors, where you went during the day. "Information gathering," Ethan confirmed. "Though I must say, Jennifer, you weren't much of a spy. You were so eager to complain about your disabled husband that you didn't notice Derek was taking notes." The cruelty of that observation, true as it was, made Jennifer flinch, but Eleanor apparently decided offense was her best defense. "So what?" Eleanor snapped, trying to reclaim her earlier bravado but failing miserably. "So my daughter was seduced by a corporate spy. She's not responsible for his crimes. And I certainly didn't know anything about assassination attempts or—" "Mrs. Morrison," Ethan interrupted, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "You kicked over a wheelchair containing a hospital owner in the middle of that hospital's lobby, while dozens of witnesses, including 3 board members, 2 state health inspectors, who happened to be conducting a surprise audit, and approximately 30 security cameras, recorded every second." Eleanor's face went from flushed to pale. So fast, Jennifer worried she might faint too. "But I didn't know you assaulted someone you believed to be disabled." Ethan continued relentlessly. You verbally abused him using language specifically targeting his perceived disability. You did this intentionally, publicly, and with clear, malicious intent. The fact that I'm not actually disabled doesn't change the hate crime nature of your actions. Hate crime? Eleanor's voice hit a register usually reserved for dog whistles. I would never. You kicked a wheelchair, Ethan repeated, each word precisely enunciated. You called me a parasite, a leech, and multiple other terms specifically related to my supposed disability. You then expressed satisfaction when I fell. All of this is on camera, Mrs. Morrison. All of it admissible in court. Jennifer wanted to defend her mother. Some ingrained filial loyalty made her want to, but the words wouldn't come because Ethan was right. She'd watched it happen, had felt satisfaction in the moment, and that made her complicit in ways she was only beginning to understand. What do you want? Eleanor asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Money? I can pay. My husband? Your husband, Charles Morrison, CEO of Morrison Financial Services, Ethan interrupted, and Jennifer's head snapped up because how did he know that? Actually owes my investment group approximately $40 million from a series of high-risk ventures that went bad last year. He's been staving off bankruptcy by taking increasingly desperate loans from increasingly questionable sources. The lobby had become an amphitheater, every person transfixed by the unfolding drama, but Ethan seemed completely comfortable with the attention. He'd been pretending to be disabled for 3 years, Jennifer realized. This, standing, commanding, controlling the room, this was natural to him. That's how do you... Eleanor sputtered, but Ethan was already continuing. I know because I'm the primary investor in Morrison Financial's debt. I bought it 6 months ago, around the time Derek started dating Jennifer. I've been waiting, Mrs. Morrison, waiting to see if you and your daughter were worth salvaging, if there was any loyalty, any basic human decency underneath the status-seeking and gold-digging. And? Jennifer found herself asking, though she already knew the answer. Ethan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw the man she'd married 5 years ago, before the shooting, before the wheelchair, before everything had gone wrong. And I found my answer this morning when you walked out without a backward glance. I found it again 30 minutes ago when your mother kicked my wheelchair and you didn't move to help. And I found it most conclusively when Derek laughed and you smiled. I didn't, Jennifer started, but memory betrayed her. She had smiled. Not broadly, not obviously, but there had been that moment of satisfaction, that sense of justice for 3 years of her youth wasted on a disabled man. What do you want? Eleanor asked again, but this time she was crying, mascara running down her cheeks in black rivulets. Please, Dr. Rivers, my husband, our family, we'll lose everything. Yes, Ethan agreed simply. You will. I'm calling in Morrison Financial's debt today. By tomorrow morning, your husband will be filing for bankruptcy. Your house, your cars, your club memberships, all of it will be liquidated to pay creditors. No! Eleanor's wail echoed off the marble, but Ethan wasn't finished. Your daughter will be terminated from Mercy General effective immediately, not for dating Derek, though that violated several fraternization policies, but for sharing confidential patient information with an unauthorized third party. Even if she didn't know she was doing it, even if Derek manipulated her, the breach happened. That's a career-ending offense in healthcare, Mrs. Morrison. Jennifer will never work as a nurse again. The words hit Jennifer like a series of physical blows. Her career, her independence, her entire identity wrapped up in those scrubs and that employee badge, gone. Not because of malice or bad luck, but because of her own choices, her own betrayal. As for the assault, Ethan continued, his attention fully on Eleanor now. I could press charges, hate crime enhancements, public disturbance, assault. You'd be looking at 3 to 5 years, Mrs. Morrison, but I'm not going to do that. Hope flickered across Eleanor's face, pathetic and desperate, but Ethan crushed it with his next words. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to let you keep your freedom and watch as everything else crumbles. Your husband's business, your social standing, your daughter's career, all of it gone because you couldn't control your cruelty for 5 minutes. You'll have to live with that, Mrs. Morrison. Every day for the rest of your life, you'll know that you destroyed your family because you kicked over a wheelchair. The silence that followed was absolute. Jennifer looked at her mother and saw, for the first time, a broken woman instead of an imperious force of nature, but she couldn't summon any sympathy. Eleanor had done this. They'd both done this in their own ways, choosing cruelty and ambition over basic human decency. Please, Eleanor whispered, dropping to her knees, not in respect like the hospital staff, but in pure desperation. Please, Dr. Rivers, I'll do anything. I'll apologize publicly in front of everyone. You'll do nothing, Ethan said firmly, because there's nothing you can do to fix this, Mrs. Morrison. You revealed who you are today. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are devastating. He turned then, facing Jennifer fully for the first time since standing up, and she saw that despite everything, despite the power, the money, the 3 years of deception, there was real pain in his eyes. I loved you, Ethan said quietly, and the past tense hit harder than any accusation. When I woke up after surgery, paralyzed and afraid, the first thing I thought of was you. How would you handle this? Would you stay? I told myself that if you did, if you stood by me through recovery, I'd tell you everything, who I really was, what I really owned, all of it. We'd have built a real life together. But I didn't, Jennifer finished, tears streaming down her face now. I complained and resented and betrayed you. You did, Ethan agreed. But Jennifer, I want you to understand something. I don't hate you. I'm not doing this out of revenge or spite. I'm doing this because you need to learn that actions have consequences, that the way you treat people, especially vulnerable people, matters, that there's a cost to cruelty. He gestured around the lobby, at the still kneeling staff, at Eleanor sobbing on the floor, at Derek restrained by security. This is that cost, this moment, this humiliation, this complete destruction of everything you thought you knew. This is what happens when you choose contempt over compassion. What am I supposed to do? Jennifer asked, her voice breaking. You've taken everything. My career, my mother's family, She couldn't say relationship, because Derek had never been real, had never been anything but a corporate spy using her loneliness and ambition. You're supposed to learn, Ethan replied. You're young, Jennifer. 32 isn't that old, despite what your mother kept telling you about wasting your prime years. You have time to become someone better than the woman who walked out this morning. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a check, Jennifer saw with disbelief. This is $50,000, enough to retrain in another field, enough to start over somewhere else. I'm giving it to you not because you deserve it, but because I remember the woman I married 5 years ago, before your mother's poison and Derek's manipulation. That woman was kind. She volunteered at free clinics. She cried at Children's Hospital. She's still in there somewhere, Jennifer. Find her again. Jennifer took the check with shaking hands, but she couldn't stop crying. Why? After everything I did, everything I said? Because someone showed me mercy once, Ethan said simply. When I was recovering, when I was at my lowest, a nurse stayed late every night to talk with me. She told me about her own struggles, her own mistakes, her own journey from cruelty to compassion. She's the one who suggested I pretend to still be disabled, to see who really cared about me versus who cared about what I could do for them. Where is she? Jennifer asked, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. Dead, Ethan said bluntly. cancer 6 months ago, but she made me promise that when I revealed myself, when I dealt with the people who'd betrayed me, I'd remember that people can change, that everyone deserves one chance at redemption. He stepped back, his posture straightening into something formal and final. This is your chance, Jennifer. Use it or waste it, but don't come back here. Don't contact me. Don't try to apologize or explain. Just be better for yourself, for your future patients, for the next man who might love you. Be the woman you were supposed to become. Catherine Wells materialized at Ethan's elbow, her professional mask back in place, but her eyes still showing shock. Dr. Rivers, the board is assembled for your meeting, and the state inspectors have some questions about today's incident. Of course, Ethan replied smoothly, every inch the hospital CEO now. Mrs. Morrison, I suggest you leave before security escorts you out. Jennifer, your final paycheck and termination paperwork will be mailed to your apartment, your old apartment, he corrected. I assume you'll be moving in with Derek, but that might be complicated now that he's being arrested for corporate espionage. Derek struggled against his restraints, trying to speak, but one of the security guards, Jennifer noticed they all wore suits, not uniforms, another detail she'd missed, placed a hand firmly on his shoulder. Wait, Jennifer said desperately as Ethan turned to leave. What happened to you? 5 years ago, who were you really? The man I thought I married was real, Ethan assured her, just incomplete. I met you at a medical convention where I was speaking about hospital administration reform. I didn't lie about that, but I was speaking as Dr. Ethan Rivers, CEO of Rivers Medical Group, owner of 12 hospitals and 17 outpatient clinics. I just didn't mention the CEO part. Why not? Ethan's smile was sad. Because every woman I'd dated before you had turned into someone different the moment they learned about my money. Grasping, calculating, already planning how to spend my wealth. You were different, Jennifer. You argued with me about healthcare policy. You called my ideas privileged and out of touch. You were real. So you lied by omission, Jennifer said, anger flickering through the devastation. Yes, Ethan agreed without hesitation. I did, and if I could go back, I'd do it differently. I'd be honest from the start. But I can't go back, Jennifer. None of us can. We can only go forward and try to do better. He walked away then, surrounded by staff and board members who treated him like the powerful man he was, but Jennifer couldn't look away. This was the man she'd married, the man she'd pitied, the man she'd betrayed, and she'd never actually known him at all. The aftermath unfolded exactly as Ethan had predicted. Charles Morrison filed for bankruptcy 3 days later, the news making regional headlines and destroying Eleanor's social standing overnight. The house sold at auction, the cars were repossessed, and Eleanor moved in with her sister in Ohio, a woman she'd spent 20 years insulting at every family gathering. Derek Thornton was indicted on multiple counts of corporate espionage and attempted murder. It turned out the assassination attempt on Ethan had been his idea, not just something he was following up on. The trial was scheduled for next spring, but his lawyers were already negotiating a plea deal. Jennifer's nursing license wasn't revoked. Ethan had apparently pulled strings to prevent that, but her termination from Mercy General was public enough that no other hospital in the state would hire her. She moved to Portland, used half of Ethan's money to enroll in a social work program, and spent her weekends volunteering at a homeless shelter. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what she'd imagined her life would be when she'd walked out of that apartment with divorce papers in her designer purse. But it was real and honest, and slowly, so slowly, she began to recognize herself in the mirror again. She never contacted Ethan. Part of her wanted to apologize properly, wanted to explain all the ways Derek and her mother had poisoned her thinking, but Ethan had been clear. This was her chance to be better, not to seek forgiveness. Still, She followed his career from a distance. 6 months after the incident, Rivers Medical Group announced a merger with 3 other hospital networks, creating the largest healthcare system in the Western United States. Ethan was on the cover of Forbes looking powerful and successful, and nothing like the gentleman in the wheelchair she'd resented. A year later, she saw his engagement announcement. Dr. Ethan Rivers to marry Dr. Sarah Chen, a neurosurgeon who specialized in spinal cord injuries. Jennifer looked at the photo. Sarah was beautiful, accomplished, confident, and felt only a dull ache where jealousy should have been. That was good, she told herself. That meant she was healing. 2 years after the incident, Jennifer got a letter. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting from 3 years of medical appointment notes. Jennifer, I heard about your social work degree. Congratulations. The homeless shelter director told me you're the best volunteer they've ever had. Patient, compassionate, genuinely invested in helping people. That's the woman I married. I'm glad you found her again. I'm not writing to reconcile or rekindle anything. I'm writing because I want you to know that I've forgiven you, not because you asked, you didn't, but because holding on to anger and betrayal was poisoning me the same way your mother's influence poisoned you. People make mistakes, Jennifer. The difference between who we are and who we become lies in what we do after the mistake. You chose to learn. You chose to grow. That takes courage. I hope you're happy. I hope you find someone who deserves the woman you've become, not the woman you were. And I hope you remember that actions have consequences, but they don't have to define us forever. Be well. Ethan. Jennifer read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't frame it or keep it where she could see it daily. She didn't need constant reminders of her worst moment, but sometimes when she was struggling with a difficult case or questioning her choices, she'd take it out and remember. Remember that she'd been given a second chance. Remember that she'd chosen to take it. Remember that being crippled, truly crippled, wasn't about whether your legs worked. It was about whether your character did. And slowly, painfully, Jennifer Morrison was learning to walk again. Eleanor Morrison never recovered. The destruction of her family's financial and social standing broke something fundamental in her, something that no amount of therapy or time could repair. She spent her remaining years bitter and alone, unable to understand how one moment of cruelty could have such devastating consequences. But sometimes, late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she'd remember the sound of that wheelchair hitting the marble floor, the way Ethan had looked up at her from the ground, still smiling that gentle smile. The moment he'd stood up and her entire world had inverted. She'd kicked over a wheelchair. She'd assaulted someone she believed was disabled. She'd done it publicly, gleefully, with her daughter and her daughter's lover watching and approving. And it had cost her everything. The lesson came too late for Eleanor, but for Jennifer, watching her mother's decline from Portland, it came just in time. Actions have consequences. Choose compassion over cruelty. And never, ever underestimate the man in the wheelchair, because you never know who might stand up